What's going on, guys? Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is about two things that shape your entire life. These two things are responsible for a lot of our thoughts, the way that we see the world, and most importantly, the way that we act and the decisions that we make. So with that being said, it's very important to be very conscious of these two things. Without any further ado, these two things are our values and the metrics by which we measure those values. Our values really do underline everything that we do. All the decisions that we make are fundamentally about what it is that we value. And values are really about prioritization. Now, a lot of us have many different values, but we hold some of them in higher regard than others. What are the values that you prioritize above everything else? Because whatever those values are going to be the same values that influence your decision making more than anything else. So if your values are grounded in unconsciousness and fear, that's going to push your life in a not so great direction. If you value what it is that other people think about you more than what type of person you actually are, you're going to be more concerned with your reputation than your actual character development. So you're going to be spending your time trying to convince people, oh, look, I have all these great qualities, instead of actually developing them. Now, if you were to ask a lot of people about their values and then go ahead and look at what it is that they do on a day-to-day basis, what they say and what they do often don't align. And that's a testament to the fact that honesty isn't a value that most people hold in high priority. But in any self-development and self-improvement, it's so important to be honest with yourself so you can properly evaluate where you're at and how your progress is going. With developing better values, it is so important to be honest with yourself in the sense that if you say, oh yeah, I'm somebody who really values exercise and health, but then your food choices are more centered around foods that taste really good than foods that are healthy for you, and if you're missing exercise, but you're fitting an hour of television into your day, well, clearly pleasure and entertainment, being the unhealthy food, providing you that sensory pleasure, and entertainment, providing you more sensory pleasure, is more valuable to you than your health and wellness. Now, theoretically, you might think, no, but I actually do care about being healthy more than I care about pleasuring myself and being entertained. But if that's not the case in your actions, then it's not the truth. And that is very, very important to be honest with yourself about, because the second that we can accept, in this example, oh, I actually value sensory pleasure more than I value my own health and wellness, that's the first step to going about consciously changing that around so you can begin to value your health and wellness more than you value the sensory pleasure. But first, you have to be honest with yourself about the fact that it's not true. Because if you think it's true, then you're not going to see that there's any problem, so to speak. You're not going to see that there's a misalignment in who you are and who you wish to be. So with that example given, you can really see how values truly do shape our entire life, especially around all of the decisions that we make. Fundamentally, the decisions that we make, which we're always making decisions, small and big, and every moment we're making decisions, those are fundamentally what's going to shape our life, because the choices we make determine the actions that we take. That's pretty obvious and straightforward, but it's important to recognize that the choices that you're making are grounded in the values that you have, and not the values that you'd like to think you have, but the values that you truly have. So remember not to bullshit yourself when you're answering the question of what are the values that I prioritize above everything else. Now, if you come up with some answers to that question, and a good way to honestly answer that question is just to look at the actions that you take. And if you find, oh, I'm not really happy with those values that I have, like when I analyze those values and I analyze the way that those values dictate my decisions, and I don't really like the road that I'm going down with these values, then you can go ahead and start to consciously rearrange your values and decide what is it that I want my life to look like in a perfect world. And for that person, the version of you that is living your ideal life, what are their values? And then you can go ahead and shift into having those values. And the way that you can truly shift into having those values is by prioritizing your actions to display those new chosen values. This is so important because so many people don't even recognize the fact that values are the things that are pushing their life in a certain directions, or that the values that they have are the things that dictate the decisions that they make. So just being conscious of how this whole process works is really important. We can begin to start choosing who we want to become and how we're going to get there. So everything I've said so far illustrates pretty well the way that values dictate our actions. But now let's talk about the second thing. My title here is These Things Shape Your Entire Life. That's plural. There's one, which is values, and two, I mentioned, is metrics. So the way that our metrics work is they go hand in hand with the values that we have. We have a value, say it's a material success. If that's a value that you have a way of measuring how well you are implementing that value, or how well you're living up to the standard of that value. And that metric that you choose is ultimately up to you. Whether consciously or unconsciously, you're choosing a metric by which to measure your values up to. Our metrics are very, very important in shaping the way that we feel about ourselves and our lives. And I'll tell you how and why that's the case through a story about a guitar player named Dave. This is a true story, and you might recognize some names in this story as I tell it. So Dave was in a band, and that band just signed their first record deal. And before the recording began, I think it was like a few days before the recording began, the band kicked Dave out of the band. So he was, pretty hurt by this. As you can imagine, record deals don't just fall out of the sky. They're pretty hard to come by. And Dave put in a lot of work with his band, and now they told him, you're out. So this didn't really sit well with Dave, as you can imagine. And right away, he came up with this plan that he was going to start a new band. And his new band was going to be far more successful than his old bands would ever be. And his old bands would always regret the day that they kicked him out of the band. So right away, Dave got to work. He put together a new band. They started writing songs. They started practicing. Soon enough, they got their own record deal. And they became very, very successful. They toured the world many times over again, and they sold over 25 million albums. Now, this guitar player named Dave is Dave from the band Megadeth. And as I said, 25 million albums sold, touring the world many times over, his new band was really, really successful. The only issue was that he vowed to be more successful than his old band would ever be. And he vowed that they would regret the day that they kicked him out of the band. The issue here is that his old band was Metallica. Metallica sold over like 150 million albums. I think more actually. I think it was like 180 million albums. So both bands were really successful. The problem for Dave is that Metallica was more successful. And in an interview in the early 2000s, Dave was really emotional and on the verge of tears when he confessed to the interviewer that he actually can't help but think of himself as a failure because of how much more successful Metallica was than his own band. See, if Dave's value here is success in the music industry, clearly any of us on the outside looking in can say 25 million albums sold, you did many world tours, you're really famous, you're a millionaire, like you're successful, dude. You made it, you did it. You accomplished the thing that you said you were going to accomplish. You lived up to the thing that you said you really valued. The issue for Dave is that he chose a very poor metric to measure the success and the degree to which that he lived up to that value. His metric to measure his success was, am I more successful than Metallica? So because the answer to that metric is no, because he wasn't, he saw himself as a failure, and he saw himself as not living up to his value as successful in the music industry. And that's because he chose a really shitty metric. So our values are really important in that they shape our lives through the decisions that we make, but the metrics that we use to measure these values are going to affect the way that we feel about those values and about ourselves. And if we choose a poor metric that doesn't really shed light on reality, we're going to be living in a little bubble of self-deception. And let's face it, the way that we feel about things is also going to dictate the way that we behave and the choices that we make. So it's important to be grounded in reality rather than our little bubble of self-deception with regard to how we're measuring our values. So it's important to choose good and accurate and objective metrics. To contrast the story of Dave from Megadeth, I want to tell you the story of Pete Best. Pete Best went through a similar thing where he was in a band that struck a record deal, and just before they started recording, he got kicked out of the band. Well, that band went on to become even bigger than Metallica. That band is the Beatles. You can imagine it would feel pretty shitty to be the guy who got kicked out of the Beatles right before they made it big. But Pete actually reported in an interview that he thinks he's happier now than he would have been if he had got to stay in the Beatles. Now, what happened with Pete was that he had a change of values. He cared more about being a family man than being a rock star. Dave went on to have a beautiful life with his wife and kids. So this illustrates wonderfully how our values and our metrics not only affect the way we act, but the way that we feel. Pete's values shifted, and that's natural. That's going to happen in our lives. Everybody's values shift at least a little bit as time goes on, and I'll talk about that more in a second. But more importantly, his metric wasn't, am I more successful in the Beatles? His metric was, am I happy in my life? Am I genuinely happy with what it is that I have and what it is that I've created in this family that I have? And the answer was yes. Dave had a shit metric. Pete had a good metric. Dave felt like shit about his life. Pete felt great about his life. There's the importance in choosing more grounded metrics to assess your situation. Now, I said I was going to talk more about shifting values, and I am. I'll talk about that now. So what happened with Pete is that his values shifted, and that's very natural. Like I said, that happens to all of us as time goes on in our lives. But it's important that we let that happen because our values have to be genuine. We're going to genuinely value things because we genuinely value them. What happens with a lot of people is their values get conflated with what they've been taught to believe. And deep down at their core, they don't actually feel in alignment with what it is that they value. So they don't actually feel in genuine alignment with the decisions that they make and the actions that they take. As you can imagine, this creates a lot of internal conflict. So let me give you guys an example of this. Perhaps you're someone who grew up in a house where the importance of family was always stressed. It was always talked about. It was always discussed. Family first, family's number one, family's the most important. So clearly, that's a value for the people that are telling you this, for your parents or your guardians, whatever. Perhaps you grow up and now you've been taught to believe that, you've been taught to value that, but now you're in your early, your mid, your late 20s, whatever, and because you've been taught that family's number one, you go ahead and you act in a way that prioritizes building a family. But as you're beginning to do this, maybe deep down there's a part of you that doesn't actually prioritize family. And that's okay. Everybody has different priorities. There's nothing wrong with not prioritizing building a family. A lot of people don't want to have children, and that's fine. But if you are somebody who deep down doesn't really want to get married quite yet or have children, but you're going to go ahead and do that anyway because that's what you've been indoctrinated to believe is like objectively the right thing to do with your life, that's going to cause a lot of inner conflict and it's just going to blow up in your face down the road. So you have to be very honest with yourself and you have to question the values that you've been taught to believe and to value as well. That's where it's really important to reflect on your values and ask yourself, do I genuinely care about this or have I just been taught and sort of indoctrinated to care about this? And not in an evil and malicious way. Like when I say indoctrinated, it sounds like, somebody fooled you and they programmed your mind. They did like program your mind, but it wasn't malicious. It's just they're projecting their values onto you. A lot of times this happens through our parents and there's, nothing wrong with that, but we should just be aware and be conscious of the fact that that's a thing that happens. Because if we're not, like I said, we cannot be aligned with our values and that can blow up in our face down the road. And maybe in your 20s, you don't want to have a family. You don't want to have a partner with children. But maybe as you explore life a little bit more, you recognize 10, 15 years later, okay, now that's something that I value. I used to value this more, but now I have like a deep yearning at my core and my heart to settle down with a family. And that's okay, our values change. See, to make a comparison to illustrate the way that values work, our values are sort of like our hypothesis. It's something that we believe to be true. It's like, I believe that I value this thing. And then our actions are like carrying out the experiments. It's like, okay, let's see if if the hypothesis comes true. Let's see if by acting on this, I validate that I really value this. And then the outcomes, our emotions and our thoughts with regard to the experiments, the actions that we took, will either validate or invalidate our hypothesis. So in the example I gave about settling down with a family, if I'm somebody who believes that I really value family, but then I take the first steps towards settling down and having a family, and I realize because my emotions and my thoughts with regard to my actions of taking the first steps towards having a family tell me that this isn't for you right now, or this isn't something that you actually want to do. And you'll know that if you're honest with yourself and the way that you feel and the way that you think, you'll know, oh, maybe I don't actually want to have a family right now. Yeah, I don't think I do. And then you've invalidated your hypothesis, and you can go about reshifting and reprioritizing your values. Whereas maybe you take the first steps towards it, and although it's like kind of scary, you have this innate yes in your core, something that mimics like a capital Y-E-S in your heart. And that is validating that value that you have of really valuing family. So that's a really good way to think about our values. If you have something that you think that you really value, you can go ahead and test it out with your actions, and your emotions and your thoughts with regards to those actions are going to tell you whether you truly value that thing or not. So on that note, I will recap. Our values fundamentally underlie everything that we do, all the decisions and actions that we make and take. It's very important to be conscious of these values for the reason of they determine where your life goes. They shape your entire life. Metrics are very important to be conscious of too, because the metrics that we choose to measure our values dictate how we feel in a lot of situations, and how we feel will go on to dictate how we act. So if we're not choosing metrics that are grounded in reality, we're going to be living in a little self-deceptive bubble and making choices that aren't grounded in the truth. Values are about prioritization. That which you prioritize the most is that which is going to dictate your decisions the most. You have to be very honest with yourself about your values, because that's the first step to being able to actually consciously rearrange them if you're not happy with how they currently are. Reflect on your values and question if they are genuine to you, and if you feel fully aligned with them, or if you've kind of just been indoctrinated and raised to believe that something is valuable, even though deep down at your core, you don't actually feel that way. And lastly, a good way to test our values is by thinking about them as the values are the hypothesis, our actions are our experiments, and the way that we feel and the way that we think about our actions are going to act as our data, and our data will either validate or invalidate our values. All right, guys, that's it for today's video. I hope you really enjoyed. If you did, be sure to give it a like. Subscribe to my channel for more content like this, and let me know what you thought in the comments down below. I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Have a good one.